The Battle of Little Inkerman had proven to be somewhat of a tonic to the recent setbacks experienced by the Army of the East before Sevastopol. Perhaps salient amongst these was the loss of the Light Brigade at Balaclava and the inability to take Sevastopol during the first bombardment. After the 26th of October, the Army, and in particular the 2nd Division, had gained a degree of confidence. The infantry had performed well, often fighting in extended order, and the guns had been worked to great effect. It was just what the British Army needed: a victory.
It was, however, not a decisive one. Little Inkerman had not been a great clash involving large numbers of either army, so what it gave in confidence to the British and reconnaissance information to the Russians would have to be put to the test sometime in the future. That time would come just 10 days later. I might remind the viewer that if you have not already watched Part 1 and 2 of this series, they will provide important background and context before carrying on here with Part 3. In the days that followed the Battle of Little Inkerman, the British quickly refocused their routine on prosecuting the siege. Trench duty, picket duty, and artillery work resumed as before. Arrangements were generally kept the same on the Inkerman Heights, with the chain of pickets existing in similar positions. With the weather increasingly developing into winter, prospects were poor. To date, no particular winter kit had arrived, and the decrepit supply arrangements often left the troops up in the Hersonese Plateau without stores and supplies, whilst those very supplies were being stockpiled at Balaclava. But that is another story for another day.
The Russians put their findings of the 26th of October to use and decided to attack the Allied army via the Inkerman Heights. Only this time it wouldn't be a reconnaissance in force, but rather an all-out assault.
The Russians had been busy to a degree. Their operations on the 26th of October had confirmed routes and British dispositions. Menshikov developed a plan to build on his incursion up on the Inkerman Heights of the 26th of October and develop it into a full-blown assault on the British right. To that end, he made arrangements with nearly all parts of his considerable army. He envisaged a two-pronged main effort, delivered in a 1-2 combination, with an attack on the Inkerman Heights, followed, upon its success, by an attack from the Balaclava Plain and the Chernaya Valley. This would gain the Sapoon Heights and roll up the British and French positions there. These two efforts would be supplemented by diversionary attacks made out of Sevastopol against the French to the west of the city. The attack on the Inkerman Heights would be undertaken by forces both from Sevastopol and a portion of the Russian field army in the interior. General Soimenov would command the Sevastopol column and would follow generally the same routes used by Colonel Fedorov on the 26th. Soimenov would be joined up on the heights by a column commanded by General Pavlov, who would cross the Chernaya at its mouth and would ascend via the Volovia Gorge and St. George's Ravine. Once the two columns had reached the heights, they would, somewhat confusingly, come under the command of General Dannenberg. Once consolidated, they would push south towards the Allied camps. While this was occurring, General Gorchakov would demonstrate, a military term used to describe an evolution of deployment and other preliminary activities, but not necessarily of attack, on the Balaclava Plain. This had the intent of occupying the attention of the Guards Brigade and the French Army of Observation, positioned along the Sapoon Heights, and prevent them from aiding the other forces further to the north. When the Inkerman Heights were captured, then Gorchakov would convert his demonstration into an all-out attack that it was hoped would crack the Allied position. To further distract from the main effort, General Tomoviov would command the sally, numbering some 3,000 men, from the west of the city against the French. Menshikov issued his orders on the 4th of November for an attack early the next morning. Although fairly sound, the Russian plan was plagued with complexity and overall flawed generalship. This would lead to holes in the command fabric on the day. Although outwardly simple, the exercise of the command and staff work was head-shakingly poor. Although possessed of great numbers of men, the Russian generals would not coordinate arrangements well. This included the issue of orders. Menshikov issued his orders directly to Soimenov and instructed him to essentially mimic the operation of the 26th of October. Dannenberg would later issue orders to Soimenov, directing him to attack at a different time and on a completely different axis, along the Victoria Ridge. As Soimenov saw Dannenberg only as being his commander later in the operation, he decided to follow the direction from Menshikov. There would be no time for reconnaissance, and the approach to the heights would have to take place in the dark.
For the British, the early morning of the 5th of November proved to be just the same as every other one had been since the attack of the 26th of October.
There had been some notice of noise, wagons seemingly, in the early pre-dawn, but this was nothing special, as the city typically moved its supplies and reinforcements this way. The men in the saps and batteries before Sevastopol shivered and tried to stay warm. Little did they know that it wasn't wagons or carts this time, but rather artillery, for there were two great Russian columns on the move, converging on the Inkerman heights. The 2nd Division had woke and prepared to stand to. The new pickets were told off, and they marched off to relieve those who had manned the positions all night. Once relieved, those weary men trudged back towards the camp of the 2nd Division. There was another aspect to the battlefield that seemed almost sinister this morning. Recent mornings had been conspicuous in the memory for a thick fog that blanketed the Inkerman heights. While some features, such as Shell Hill, were left exposed, lower ground and the numerous folds and valleys seemed to collect it. It made everything damp and clung to the scrub oak, unable to move. Visibility across much of the Inkerman heights was reduced to mere yards or even feet. Already cold and undoubtedly somewhat apprehensive about the lack of visibility, the pickets took up their positions and threw out their chain of sentries into the murky pre-dawn. Thus, with the pickets newly relieved, British forces on the Inkerman heights remained in their defensive posture. The Guards Brigade remained in their positions along the Sapoon heights. The 2nd Division's right pickets were fielded all by the 55th, with those 4 pickets stretching from the Guards Brigade to out near the Sandbag Battery and the top of St. Clement's Ravine, linking in to the position at the barrier guarding the top of the Quarry Ravine, and up the western slopes of that feature, with the ability to look further down on its lower reaches. The right pickets were under the command of Colonel Carpenter of the 41st. From here, ensconced on Shell Hill, the left pickets of the division took up the chain of protection. The 2 pickets on top of Shell Hill were fielded by the 41st, and the screen extended down to the west jut, where 2 pickets of the 47th were positioned. The left pickets were under the command of Colonel Hawley of the 47th. As mentioned, the Light Division had taken up responsibility of guarding the Careenage Ravine, as well as maintaining their positions around the Lancaster Battery on Victoria Ridge. The Guards maintained their picket on Quarter Guard Point, at the mouth of the Wellway, to guard against any incursion into the rear of the 2nd Division camp.
As it was, there would be very little time spent waiting, for a vast Russian host was about to sweep over the heights.
The lead elements of the Russian army were from Soimenov's 10th Division, the Tomsk, Kolovansk, and Katherinburg regiments. They had left Sevastopol via the Sapper Road and gained the heights near St. George's Brow, where they had deployed into their attack formation to begin their advance to Shell Hill and beyond. Supporting them was a column of naval infantry who detached and headed up the Careenage Ravine. The darkness and the fog did their part to conceal their movements and intentions. The balance of Soimenov's forces marched in the rear and were acting as his core reserve. Pavlov's column had been delayed at the bridge over the Chernaya, and thus the bulk of his forces were still en route to the rendezvous with Soimunov when the attack began. 2 regiments, the Borodino and Tarotin regiments, did detach from the column and began to climb the Volovia Gorge. They were to act as the left flank protection for the main assault. The remainder of the column marched along the water's edge, where they were to climb St. George's Ravine and link up with Soimunov. Dawn was just breaking, shortly before 6 o'clock, and the new pickets had assumed their positions. Captain Hugh Rowlands of the 41st's 53-strong Grenadier Company, forming the picket on Shell Hill, had settled his company down for the remainder of the morning and marched his sentries out, posting them further out than they had been during the night, as they had been drawn quite close in due to the fog. He had no sooner returned to the remainder of the company when firing broke out. It was probably a combination of contacts happening very close to one another. The 30-strong Guards sharpshooters, seemingly without their commander, Captain Goodlake, had been out far in advance of the picket line atop St. George's Brow. And although they could not see the enemy as yet, they could certainly hear them. The small band of guardsmen waited, and then engaged what was very quickly understood to be a sizable Russian force moving towards the heights. Completely unable to staunch the flow of Russians moving irrexibly eastward, they beat a steady retreat back towards the picket line of the 2nd Division. Coming on was the Russian 10th Division, in their attack formation. Preceded by men of the 6th Rifles acting as skirmishers, the Kolovansk and the Tomsk regiments were deployed in the now familiar Russian mixed order of both company and battalion column. Following on were the 22 guns of the accompanying artillery and the Catherineburg regiment in battalion columns. Overall, this represented somewhat less than half of Soimunov's total strength. As yet undetected, but maintaining their position abreast of the main advance, the naval infantry moved down the Karinage ravine. There could not have been much time before the outlying sentries of the 41st Grenadier Company became aware of some activity to their front, and the appearance of the Guards sharpshooters falling back through the fog with the Russian skirmishers hot on their heels confirmed only one thing. This was no probe or patrol, but rather a major attack. The sharpshooters fought their way back to the picket line of the 2nd Division, and at some point near Shell Hill made contact with its outlying sentries. The Battle of Inkerman had begun.
Waiting in the foggy gloom, the men of the 41st and the 47th, forming the left pickets that morning, would be the first of the 2nd Division into action.
The sporadic firing of the Guards' sharpshooters and the retort of the skirmishers of the 6th Rifles would have given a muffled report, and as yet they were invisible. There must have been a moment, however, where the lonely sentries, long accustomed to tedious, bone-chilling hours on sentry duty, must have been jolted from their lethargy and steeled to action.
Hey, stand to, there's something out there. All right, yeah.
True to their duty, the sentries engaged the oncoming Russians, alerting the remainder of the pickets some distance behind. Faced with overwhelming odds, the sentries fell back on their picket's position, where they organized for a more determined resistance.
On the move back, come on! All right.
By that point, all were alerted, and the pickets would have been stood too. Seeing the sentries running in would have made hearts race and mouths dry up.
Halt! Who comes there? Friend! The Russians, they're coming! Friend! All right, pass, friend. Come on. All right, get out of the way.
Over at Rowland's Grenadier Company, his sentries had commenced firing. Rather than wait for them to arrive, he decided to stand to and extend the balance of his picket with a view to advancing to their aid. He had but 150 yards or so to go in order to reach them, and as he did, he found his tiny company in the face of literally thousands of Russians. He had no option but to withdraw back over Shell Hill. There he lay in wait on a small rise to await the oncoming host. They came on through the fog, and Rowlands ordered, "Commence firing." The damp of the morning wreaked its awful havoc, and a great number of the firelocks misfired. All along the line of the left pickets of the 2nd Division, this was the opening of a general action. The men stood and fought where they could, clearing their weapons as they were able to, and desperately returned fire. But the pickets couldn't hold out by themselves. Bit by bit, they withdrew through the fog and the scrub. As the pickets withdrew steadily back and over Shell Hill, Soimonov's strength materialized on the heights. The 16 battalions of his reserve, the Vladimir, Sudol, Uglitz, and Burtursk regiments, and the balance of his guns were marching steadily in the rear. And a most unfortunate demise had been met by the Light Division picket in the bed of the Karinaj ravine. They had been surprised by the advancing Russians, and for the most part had been captured, leaving the flanking column to press on down the ravine. The 47th Pickets on West Jut were forced to abandon their positions and also withdraw, conforming to those of the 41st on their right. Thus far, the attack and defense were playing out in a very similar way to the attack of the 26th of October. Only here, the Russian strength was immense. Soimonov had great reserves left. The Katerinburg and the other regiments under his command had not yet been committed. Pavlov was still navigating his way to the heights, but had detached his 2 flanking regiments, who had begun their ascent of the Volovia Gorge. Much like the attack of the 26th of October, Soimonov was pressing to bring his guns into action on Shell Hill. As the pickets were pushed off that feature and it became somewhat secure, the powerful Russian artillery galloped up and established the beginnings of what would become an impossibly strong artillery position that would eventually number some 90-plus pieces. The first shots from the Russian guns crashed out, directing their fire at Home Ridge and the British positions thereon.
What had begun as the faint report of sporadic musketry had risen to a crescendo. Immediately, from all across the British position, men and guns, as well as those of their French allies, began shifting to meet this significant threat.
Remember that the Russian plan had been to set a demonstration down on the Balaclava plain in order to keep the Allied troops on the Sapoon Heights from moving to the succor of the 2nd Division. Gorchakov had indeed deployed, and Raglan had been made aware and was in the process of trying to determine the Russian intent. It would seem that as the initial action was developing on the Inkerman Heights, that Gorchakov's demonstration was working. Just. The guards under the Duke of Cambridge had stood too on the Sapoon Ridge, and the French troops under General Bosquet had done the same. As we shall see, however, this threat would not develop as initially expected. The response to the initial action and subsequent resistance of the pickets would develop very quickly, and the old pickets who had only just been relieved had barely made it back to camp when the faint but growing report of the pickets' musketry out on the heights became apparent. Pennefather, the loud, boisterous commander of the division's 1st Brigade, had assumed command of the whole division after Evans had sustained a fall from his horse, seemingly resulting in a very serious concussion. He saw similarities developing from the action of Little Inkerman, as it has since become known, but contrary to the tactics used some days before, this much larger attack would have to be resisted much more stiffly, farther out from the camp, if time was to be had to concentrate the necessary reinforcements needed to repel such an advance. This radically changed his approach to the coming battle. Rather than make a stand at Home Ridge, as had been the case on the 26th, Pennefather decided that only by thickening the picket line could time be captured for the arrival of succor from other parts of the army. So, as the pickets fought on staunchly, retiring as slowly as they could, and the first Russian artillery shells burst over Home Ridge. Pennefather committed the lion's share of his division to the fight at the picket line. The camp had stood to early in the morning, as was the case every morning, but had stood down just as dawn was breaking. There were only minutes before the faint sound of musketry off in the distance had caused the division to stand to arms yet again. As the alarm was raised by the drummers playing their bugles, the camp was struck, tentage was brought to the ground, and the battalions of the division fell in behind Home Ridge. The Russian artillery fire had taken the British in camp somewhat by surprise, and there are many anecdotes of the first shells exploding not long after the old pickets had arrived back in camp. The camp was behind the low rise of Home Ridge, but overshoots simply passed over the ridge and landed amongst the tents and facilities there. Life was not worth 10 minutes' purchase, as they, having got the accurate range, were throwing a storm of shot and shell, and their fire was incessant, wrote George Cavendish Taylor of the 95th. Pennefather immediately dispatched a wing of the 30th to reinforce the left pickets, fighting presently on the near slopes of Shell Hill. The other wing of the 30th was sent to the barrier to reinforce the picket of the 55th, who were not yet in action but surely would be soon. A wing of the 49th was set out to occupy a supporting position at the top of the Mikriakov Glen, and a wing of the 47th was sent out a little bit farther to the left along that feature to assist. To the right, Pennefather sent the 41st, less the 2 companies on picket, to the vicinity of the Sandbag Battery and the top of St. Clement's Ravine, with the other wing of the 49th to support them from Fore Ridge. This left him with the 95th, 4 companies of the 55th, and 2 companies of the 47th, which, with the addition of his 2 batteries, totaling some 12 guns, formed a small reserve. Things would not stay as such for long, as very quickly the 2 guns, kept limbered up at all times, had galloped up to Home Ridge and were in action against their Russian counterparts. The report of musketry from Shell Hill and the subsequent shelling of Home Ridge brought about significant reaction from all the Allied forces on the eastern Chersonese plateau. Perhaps the first to react was the neighbouring Light Division. General Codrington, the commander of that division's 1st Brigade, had been out inspecting his pickets when Goodlake and his guards had been bumped into by the Russians. He swiftly collected a large part of his brigade, then in camp, as well as some on picket, and rushed them up the Victoria Ridge, where they lined its northern heights overlooking the Karinage Ravine. These men would play a significant part in the action in supporting the 2nd Division from across the ravine. Buller's 2nd Brigade of the Light Division was in the trenches that morning, but he quickly dispatched a wing of both the 88th and the 77th, with direction to move presently to Home Ridge. From Cathcart's 4th Division was initially sent P Battery of the Royal Artillery, which was to make best speed. Following on would be the bulk of the division, totaling some 2,200 men. They were a ways away, and their arrival at Home Ridge would be somewhat delayed due to the distance that they had to cover. As we shall see, they wouldn't fight as a division, but rather, as they approached the epicenter of the battle, they would be split into smaller and smaller units, plugging gaps and making attacks as required. Early on, it hadn't been clear whether or not Gortchakov's demonstration down on the plain was actually a threat or not. As the initial action developed, it was decided it was nothing more than theatre, and to that end, 2 battalions of the Guards Brigade, the 3rd Grenadiers and the 1st Battalion Scots Fusilier Guards, were dispatched early on. The Coldstream Guards were on picket duty, and it would take some time for them to concentrate in camp and move towards the sound of the guns. The French, too, had determined that Gortchakov had no real intent of attacking immediately, and General Bosquet immediately dispatched 2 battalions of his Army of Observation, and made for Home Ridge to liaise with the commander there. An unfortunate delay occurred in the sending of further reinforcements. Just south of Home Ridge, Bosquet met Generals Cathcart and Brown, who mystifyingly determined that his further assistance would not be necessary. This would thankfully be rectified later on, and large numbers of French troops would end up playing a critical role later in the battle. In what might be considered to be his only real meaningful decision during the battle, Raglan sent for two 18-pounders from the army's siege train, concentrated farther to the south. He ordered these to be brought to Home Ridge. These large, powerful guns would take considerable time to arrive, but as we shall see, would prove to be pivotal in the coming battle. The day had hardly begun, and the Inkerman Ridge was alive with activity. The din of battle on and around Shell Hill carried through the fog. Soimonov's initial push to Shell Hill had been completely successful, and his guns were now in action at its crest. With his first task complete, he decided to pause and wait for Pavlov to arrive. Pavlov, of course, had been delayed crossing the Chernaya and had not yet ascended St. George's Ravine. Two of his regiments had, however, detached and were climbing up the Volovia Gorge towards the East Jut. While Soimonov waited, he decided to conduct a reconnaissance of sorts out to his right flank, and sent a battalion of what was probably the Catherineburg Regiment to fulfill this task. They would advance and probe the reaches of the Mikrikov Glen and the approaches to Home Ridge. While this was happening, the under-road column, quite out of contact, continued up the Karinage Ravine. Bypassing the main body of the pickets in the fog, the reconnoitering column pushed down into the glen and made its way up its length. As part of the supporting arrangements for his picket line, Pennefather had positioned a wing of the 47th under Fortis and a wing of the 49th, now under Grant, along the southern edge of the glen. With the fog, visibility was very limited, and Soimonov's battalion made its way near the entire length of the feature undetected. That is, until a voice boomed out of the mist. "Give them a volley and charge!" It was Grant. His 230 rifles crashed out, catching the lone Russian column somewhat by surprise, and at very close range. Their fire delivered, the 49th plunged through the scrub with their bayonets at the charge. The Russians broke and fled back the way they had come, with the men of the 49th at their heels like terriers, all the way back to Shell Hill. This would be the first instance of many that day, when small groups, often in extended order, would inflict local defeats on Russian efforts, seemingly out of all proportion to the numbers involved. The closeness of the scrub oak and the blanket of fog would all play their part in concealing the significant dearth of British depth and reinforcement. Help was on its way, and by this point the first elements of which were arriving on the battlefield. The wing of the 88th and the wing of the 77th, both from the neighbouring Light Division, were making their final approach to Home Ridge. In addition, P Battery from Cathcart's 4th Division were close by. The 88th were sent to the head of the Mikrikov Glen, in the same vicinity to where the 49th had been. Following on, 3 guns of P Battery were ordered to push forward to the same location. The under-road column had, by this point, navigated the Karinage Ravine and were pushing up the Wellway. Fog and noise proved to be too much of a distraction to the guards picket on Quarterguard Point, to whom they were invisible. The under-road column, unbeknownst to anyone, had come up the Wellway and were in sight of the deserted 2nd Division camp, when a classic piece of battlefield bad luck occurred. As the column marched out of the Wellway, there appeared a line of grey greatcoats. Following the 88th, the wing of the 77th under Egerton, intent on heading towards the sound of the guns, much like the 88th had, the 77th had skirted the 2nd Division camp and the scene of ruin it had become due to the Russian bombardment from Shell Hill. As they pushed on towards Home Ridge, out of the fog came the lead elements of the under-road column on their left. With a word of command, the 77th turned left into line and delivered a charge, which broke the Russians, with their lead elements pushing back against their rear. Confusion reigned, and the Russians withdrew in disorder back down the Wellway. The 77th remained in check and reformed to continue their march to Home Ridge. As the Russians withdrew, the guards picket, alerted now to some activity below them, lined the edge of Quarterguard Point and engaged the withdrawing Russians with musketry. This finished them off and sent the column back up the Karinage Ravine, never to play another meaningful role in the remainder of the battle. While comparatively decisive in their own right, these two small actions would soon be eclipsed by what would follow. Soimanov, seeing his probe recoil under the pressure of the 49th's attack and arrive back on Shell Hill, decided that waiting for Pavlov was wasted time. He ordered his lead division into the attack. This would be paralleled, in a somewhat uncoordinated way however, by Pavlov's 2 regiments, the Tarotine and the Borodino, climbing the Volovia Gorge. Pennefather's 12 guns had been doing their best to reply to the ever-increasing numbers of guns coming into action on Shell Hill, and Soimanov's 10th Division picked a somewhat indirect route to Home Ridge, following closely the route taken by the reconnoitering column, in order to avoid British artillery fire. Thus, the attack was launched with some 10 battalions against what amounted to 1, composing the British picket line, which was by now quite low on ammunition. This overwhelming weight of numbers pushed back the screen, and the attack became heavily echeloned to the right, spilling down into the Mikirikov Glen and its environs. It would seem that the right-hand elements of Soimanov's attack pushed across the mouth of the glen, straight into the wing of the 47th, under Fortis. The 4 companies of that regiment on the Mikirikov Spur extended in the scrub and responded to the order to commence file firing, the independent firing of the era, and the 140 files began to pour their fire into the flank and head of the Russians, struggling to push through the thick, dense scrub below them. The continuous fire from above tore away at the Russian column, and it broke, chased away by the deadly fire of the Minier rifle, until they climbed back out of the Mikirikov Glen towards Shell Hill. As Soimanov's right continued to push on through the glen, the next battalions, probably from the Katherineburg or the Tomsk regiments, bumped into the newly arrived 88th, or Connaught Rangers. No sooner had the 88th got their bearings, formed into line and extended, a great mass of Russians spilled out of the fog and caught them by surprise. The 4 companies were split in 2. The left 2 enjoyed some success with a quick volley and charge, sending a large number of the enemy all the way to West Jut. The right of the line was less successful and were thrown back stiffly upon the 3 guns of P Battery, which had come into action just behind them. The Irishmen, withdrawing in extended order, pushed back through the battery position, with the Russians hot on their heels. Lieutenant Miller, commanding the guns, had only time to fire 1 round of case before the proximity of the Russians forced his gunners to take up handspikes and rammers and charge. Woefully underarmed, this spirited attack, while not stopping the Russians, checked them long enough for the 88th men to get away. The guns, however, were captured, to the celebrations of the Russians on the spot, but strangely they did not follow up their success and press on to Home Ridge. The remaining battalions of the Tomsk and Kovalance regiments continued to press on towards Home Ridge. There was little to stop them by this time. The pickets were exhausted in both energy and ammunition. Just as this considerable Russian effort seemed as though it was going to sweep the pickets aside and reach Home Ridge, Egerton's voice echoed through the din. "Give them a volley on the knee and charge!" The 77th had reformed after their meeting engagement with the Under Road column and were continuing up and over Home Ridge as they neared the area of the previous actions of the 49th and the 88th. The 77th advanced past the men of the 49th and took the Russian column in the right flank. The volley, delivered by some 260 men, crashed out. Cheering, the 77th plunged forward into the reeling Russians. Some resistance was encountered, but the energy of the 77th's attack and their continuous rifle fire and impetus broke the back of the Russian right. At some point during the 77th's advance, there appeared a mounted figure through the fog and brush. Taking aim, a man of the 77th fired his P-51 Minier rifle and saw the man fall from his saddle. This was in fact General Soimanov himself, who fell mortally wounded. It would seem that his death caused some consternation amongst his corps, and the 10th Division's role during the developing battle would be very little from this point on. For the time being, however, the center and left of the Russian attack continued pressing on towards Home Ridge. They had to contend only with the exhausted pickets, who were running low on ammunition. They withdrew steadily towards Home Ridge, until within the view of Pennefather's guns. Seeing them come straight back, a Sergeant Conway of G Battery rushed forward, commanding them to lie down. Despite the proximity of the Russians and what might be considered to be a recipe for defeat, they did. In doing so, the guns along the breastwork had a clear view of the approaching Russians, and they opened fire with deadly case shot, which tore through the Russian ranks with grisly effect. Their advance faltered, and seizing the moment, the weary pickets, by now dead tired and out of ammunition, impossibly mixed up with each other from their long withdrawal, sprang to their feet and charged into the Russians. This was augmented by the timely intervention of the other wing of the 49th, under Bellairs, who launched themselves at the Russian left from their position just forward of Home Ridge. The intensity of the close-range gunfire and the timely charge was too much for the advancing Tomsk and Kovalansk men, and they fell back in disorder with the pickets' bayonets at their backs. This finished the Russian attack on the left, and the Russians, so imposing in their mass, had been defeated out of all proportion by a series of singular, sharp actions, executed with dash and bravery, and in most cases supported by the crushing fire of the Minié rifle. For the time being, action waned on the left of Home Ridge. The Russian threat was not just on the British left. While Soimonov's 10th Division had been forcing the pickets back, the 2 regiments from Pavlov's command, plus 1 battalion of the Catherineburg Regiment, which had strangely detached from its fellow battalions and moved across Shell Hill, had been advancing steadily up and over East Jut. The Borodino Regiment had picked its way down into the Kori Ravine and were advancing up the post road towards the barrier, whilst the Tarotine Regiment and the lone Catherineburg Battalion advanced to their left up and over the upper reaches of the Inkerman Tusk. In their way stood the wing of the 30th at the barrier under Malouverer, and, conspicuous with their colours and with nearly all their companies present, stood the 41st, under Major Eamon, although the brigade commander, General Adams, had accompanied them. As the Borodino approached the barrier, Malouverer gave the command to fire. Like in many instances that morning, the men's rifles misfired after being damp from the night before. The 30th became uneasy as the 4 Borodino battalions threatened. Sensing this, Malouverer vaulted over the barrier and led his men in a spirited charge. The Borodinos fell back upon themselves and broke, retreating back down the Kori Ravine. Sensing the ebb and flow of battle, Adams ordered the 41st to advance to meet the Tarotine men. The 41st commenced company volleys, and their rifles bore upon the Russians. In short order, the Tarotine troops faltered, and, upon the 41st's subsequent charge, went for the closest shelter they could find, down to the bottom of St. Clement's Ravine. Both the 30th and the 41st pursued their foes for a short while, but remained in hand to return to their starting positions. For the time being, the British position was secure. The somewhat piecemeal defeat of the 10th Division and its supporting elements, combined with the death of Soimonov, effectively hamstrung those forces, who had been under his command. They would contribute very little moving forward. This brings us to the end of Part 3. In Part 4 of this series, we'll cover the advance of the 4th Division and the attack of the Guards Brigade. The references for this series have been covered in previous videos. Suffice it to say, there have been quite a few. The works of Barthorpe, Mercer, and Kinglake being conspicuous, as well as the period drill book of 1847. A very special thank you goes to Harry, a serving member of the Grenadier Guards, who sent along a bearskin plume and a valise plate that did duty as the ammunition pouch plate for the shooting vignettes featuring Grenadiers. Thanks as well to Hugh Small of hughsmall.co.uk for the provision of his 3D imagery. This was of great help in producing all the 3D map work seen in the presentation. As well to Patrick Mercer for the use of some of his modern photographs of the area. These helped greatly in placing the contours and maps in a better light. If you're in need of exceptionally high quality and historic ammunition for your P53 Enfield, then stop by Brett's website, papercartridges.com. His work is of the highest quality, and his cartridges are the closest thing you'll find to an original anywhere. If you'd like to support the channel, please stop by our Patreon page. The link is in the description below. And for more information on projects and updates between videos, follow us on our Facebook page.